Okay. Just FYI, apparently we can be heard in the main room too. So if you want to just start it, Chelsea, I think we can go ahead and do that.
We should be good to go. We are recording.
Great, perfect. Then good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first Pediatric Ethics Grand Rounds of 2025-2026 academic year. Thank you for joining us at our modified time this month. We'll be back to our normal slots later on this year. Just a few reminders for Pediatric Ethics Grand Rounds. These sessions are approved for continuing education credit. To make sure you get credit, you'll need to either text the SMS code that's on your screen and in the chat, that PEGR925, to the phone number that's there, or you can go to the ce.childrenscolorado.org/code site and type that same code in. And that will ensure that you get credit for being here. It will also ensure us that you'll get an evaluation from us so that we can hear your feedback on today's session as well as your idea for future sessions. You'll have about a week after today's session to fill that out, so please do that. Today's session is moderated for Q&A, so if you have questions, you can use the question and answer box at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit any questions and comments that you may have for today's session. I think that's it for general announcements. So with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Warren Binford. Professor Binford is an internationally recognized children's rights scholar and an advocate who focuses on the challenges that children face in the 21st century, including the migration experience. She has personally inspected numerous facilities where children are kept by the federal government, and she has interviewed the children who are kept there. She's advocated for the respect of all of their rights in litigation, in Congress, at public events, and in the media. You may have seen her on TV advocating for exactly the same things that she's going to be talking about today. She is a tenured professor at the University of Colorado School of Medicine and is the inaugural chairholder for the W.H. Lee Endowed Chair for Justice in Pediatric Law, Policy, and Ethics. She's also the director of advocacy for the Kempe Center here at the CU campus. In addition to that, she's a core faculty member at the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at the University of Colorado and is a professor of law by courtesy at the University of Colorado Law School. Professor Binford will be talking to us about the experiences of immigrant and refugee children in the United States. I cannot think of a better person to start off our academic year. So with that, Professor Binford, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I would like to talk to you, as Brian mentioned, about caring for immigrant children in America, which seems to be becoming more and more challenging with each news cycle. I have no financial disclosures to report, and I'm so thrilled to see the number of people who are attending today and who expressed interest, because it affirms for me my sense of our community here at Children's Hospital and at the University of Colorado, which is that we care about these children because of our shared humanity. But there's another reason to care about immigrant children in particular as a population, and that's because of the high level of diversity of the community that we've chosen to provide care in. That I actually was motivated in part to leave my previous university and come to CU Anschutz because it was in such a culturally rich community with a significant number of people born outside the United States. In fact, in the United States overall, there's about 14% of people who were born in another country. And in Colorado, it's even lower at 9.6%. But here in Aurora, 1 in 5 residents was born outside the United States, and there is no majority ethnic group in the community that we serve and we work. When you look at the Aurora Public School students' composition, you see that these students come from over 130 different countries and that they speak 160 languages. In fact, 42% of the students in our community are second language learners, and about almost 3,000 are migrant and refugee children. And there's even more in the Denver area public schools, 6,000 approximately. One of the populations that I specifically researched when I was deciding to come to the University of Colorado was how many unaccompanied children, excuse me, live in Aurora. And the number is actually quite high for a single community. It's 1,500 over the last decade. And that's significant because whereas all immigrant children, as we'll talk about, face certain challenges, unaccompanied children have a very high level of need because of the traumas that drove them to the United States, some of the traumas that they may have experienced during the process of coming to the U.S. and then upon arrival. And so we'll talk about some of those challenges in a minute. So of course, we're not just talking about Aurora today. We're talking about children across the country. And so I just wanted to give you a sense of what this looks like. And basically, 3 to 4% of children in America today were foreign born, and they are 10 years old on average. When you look at where they come from, about half of them are coming from Latin America and the Caribbean, and then the second largest region where they come from is Asia. And this is a breakdown. Although the country that provides us with the single largest percentage is Mexico, that's still just 13% of all of the children who are here in America today, but were born in other countries. So how did these children come to the US? How did they come to be here? As Brian mentioned, I received a call about 8 years ago, asking me to do some interviews of children arriving to the US. And at that time, what was not publicly known was that the administration at that time was piloting a new policy, which was to separate children from their parents upon arrival. And in interviewing the children, interviewing the parents, I learned a lot about what brought them to the United States. And how we usually think about this as push and pull factors. And one thing that was very clear is that a lot of the kids arriving in the United States are here because of uncontrolled violence in their home countries. A number of children, particularly children who are refugees, and we'll talk about what that means in a moment, are here because of war in their home country. Some of them were victims of that war, sometimes as child soldiers, sometimes as children who had been enslaved by adult soldiers in those wars and were trying to escape that brutality. In Central America, in particular the Northern Triangle, which is El Salvador and Guatemala and Nicaragua, that there's a lot of, Honduras, that there is a lot of gang activity to the point that gangs control entire regions in those countries, and in fact are often moving trafficking items such as people that they've enslaved and guns and other arms and drugs from South America and even other regions through Central America. And so they're controlling a lot of that region. And children are often forced into those gangs. The boys are often forced into those gangs, sometimes between around 7 and 11, and are often used as runners. And if you choose or try and refuse to be in the gang, the kids that I've interviewed have talked about, threats of being killed. One little boy, his friend was decapitated right next to him when they were trying to escape a gang that was trying to enslave them. And then the girls are often forced in the gangs between the ages of around 10 and 14, often as sex slaves to powerful gang members. Of course, in addition to the violence and the war and the gangs, a lot of these kids are coming because of poverty in their home countries. And a lot of the girl children, there are usually more boys who are coming to the United States, particularly as unaccompanied. But a lot of the girl children talk about the misogyny in their cultures and their countries, including severe sexual abuse. In addition to these really scary things that we're talking about, there are also some very positive pull factors, and it's important for us to recognize the real privilege that we have living in the United States and what that means for the children who come to be here. Many people don't understand that the United States has been in a cross-border relationship with Latin America for over 100 years. And we have actively recruited people to work here in the United States for much of that time. And we've actually entered into treaties to try and get countries to allow their citizens to come here and live and work in the United States. And that means that the majority of the kids who come to the United States, they have family members here. The unaccompanied children who arrive in the United States, about 89% of them are eventually reunited with family here in the US, and approximately 91% of immigrant children in the United States overall are living in with their family. We have a real problem in the United States with violence when you look at other developed countries, and so we know that we're not the safest country in the world, but relative to the countries where a lot of these kids come, we are relatively peaceful and have much more security than what they have at home. And so a lot of times they are trying to come into the United States so that they can get away from criminal enterprises, to get away from being robbed or extorted or trafficked, etc. And so that is one of the pull factors that brings them to us. And then, of course, we do have such a strong and vibrant economy that attracts children as well. Some of them want to work, and some of them come to the United States for education. We see particularly teenage children who want to get an education, and they've been abandoned by their parents in their home countries, and they come to the US to try and create a better life for themselves. And that is demonstrates a tremendous amount of courage. That's quite inspiring. And then I've interviewed a number of children and families who have kids who have healthcare issues, special needs, and those needs are not being met in their home countries. And so they come here for the healthcare in order to either keep their child alive or help their child to have a quality of life that couldn't be accomplished in their home country. So although we talk about immigrant children in the United States collectively, the fact is that there are a tremendous number of statuses that children have once they arrive in the United States. Of course, the most secure one is to be a lawful permanent resident, and usually they get this status because their parent has a work visa. They have family who have sponsored them to come to the United States. They may be in the process of being adopted by a US adult. In addition to that, in the United States, people have a right to come here for the purpose of seeking asylum. If they're subjected to political persecution in their home country or religious persecution, they can come here and say, hey, I'm presenting myself as an asylum seeker, and I'd like to apply for asylum. And if they do that, they are here legally, and we cannot deport them without due process. And so it gets very confusing because people will talk about somebody who's undocumented, but it's important for us to recognize that even though someone might not have documentation when they arrive in the United States, if they come to the United States without documentation for the purpose of seeking asylum, they are here lawfully, and we cannot deport them, until they've completed the full asylum application process. In addition to that, we have refugees, which is related to asylum seekers. And usually refugees is a category that you get if you apply for asylum and you're given asylum, then you're categorized as a refugee. However, you can be given the status of refugee without coming to the United States by applying from another country, either your home country or a third party country, and applying there for refugee status and seeking permission to come to the US as a refugee. And once you're classified as a refugee, then you have certain rights, certain privileges that you would not have as just an asylum seeker, or if you were undocumented without being in the process of seeking asylum. In addition to these categories, the lawful permanent resident, asylum seeker, and refugees, we also have humanitarian parolees. And this is basically a temporary status that the United States gives people from certain countries that are experiencing, particular upheavals. It could be, for example, a natural disaster, or it could be a war. It could be that the government is unstable, and so we as a humanitarian Act for residents of that country. We sometimes say, hey, you can come to the United States for a limited period of time while your home country works through these issues. In addition to humanitarian parolees, we also show humanitarian status to a number of victims. So these include children who have been abused or neglected or abandoned by their parents, either in their home country or after coming to the United States. And those children can apply for what's called SIGIS, this special immigrant juvenile status. Also, if somebody has been trafficked, an adult or a children, they can apply for a T visa. And if they've been the victim of another major crime, they can apply for a U visa. And this prevents them from being deported and gives them the, for a limited period of time, and gives them the opportunity to have a pathway to citizenship or lawful permanent resident status. In addition to that, a lot of us have heard about DACA, which is the Deferred Action Childhood Arrivals. And basically, this is a temporary status of normally 2 years. It can be renewed every 2 years. And this was a status that was created under of President Obama's administration. And what happens is that we have a lot of people in the United States who do not have lawful status to be here and are subject to deportation, but we have limited resources and we can't deport them all. And frankly, for economic and other reasons, we don't want to deport them all. And so we have created a temporary category that allows someone who arrived in the United States as a child during certain years, it's just for a limited period in history, that they were brought here to the United States without documentation. They did not come of their own free will, and they have been a law-abiding, good neighbor, good community member. They're going to school, they're being financially independent, they're working, etc. And so this temporary status was created so that they would know that they could pursue a job, that they could enroll in higher education and continue to better themselves and better our country without fear of deportation for the next 2 years. This, as is a number of these statuses, are currently being challenged, and so we'll see what happens with this program. But when we talk about DACA, kids and DACA students, DACA residents, this is whom we're talking about. And then the undocumented portion of children in the United States, the remaining portion are about 50 to 60% are undocumented. And I have such a broad range there because we really don't have solid numbers on that. Despite the fact that we have all these different categories, all these different statuses that kids might have when they come to the United States, the fact is that all of these children have constitutional rights under the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Supreme Courts and federal courts have recognized for decades that our Constitution is not limited to U.S. citizens or even lawful permanent residents, that all children within our border have First Amendment rights, which include free speech, freedom of association, the freedom to petition the government for relief. They also have rights to be free from unlawful search and seizure under the Fourth Amendment. They have rights to due process under the Fifth Amendment, as well as the 14th Amendment. And this is important because, as you will recall, the ACLU sued the federal government in 2017 for separating children from their parents. And that, in that case, which was Mizell versus ICE, the court recognized that regardless of the status that someone has in our country, they have the same right to family integrity that we all do, and that you can't separate children from their parents without due process, in the same way that you couldn't take my child from me without going through a certain process and different findings. And so they have those same rights, even if they are not citizens or do not have a lawful status for being here. In addition to those amendments, they also have additional protections under the 14th Amendment, which give them right to education, same as all other children within our borders. And also they have the right to birthright citizenship. You may have read in the media in the last few days that the current administration has appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court to determine whether or not that birthright citizenship should in fact extend to everyone in the United States, or if it was only supposed to extend to enslaved people and the immediate children of people who had been enslaved in the 1800s here in the United States. So we'll see whether the U.S. Supreme Court decides to take that up. And in the meanwhile, the federal courts that have decided that case so far have said that birthright citizenship applies to everyone born in the United States, regardless of what their status is when they are born here. In addition to the constitutional rights that all immigrant children have in the United States, they also have human rights. And these are a result of international treaties that the United States has ratified and obligates them to the rights under the treaties. And some of these are the same as rights that the kids have under our Constitution, but it's important to recognize that they have multiple sources of certain rights. So, for example, the U.S. is a party to the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, and that gives all immigrant children in the United States the right to be treated equally as every other child in the United States, and to have due process before any of their rights are taken away. They also have a right to be free from torture and cruel, degrading, and inhumane treatment, and that's based upon the U.S.'s status as a party to the Convention Against Torture. And then all immigrant children in the United States are entitled to be free from racial discrimination, and that's based upon our ratification of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And then there are some categories of children who have immigrated to the United States that not all kids have, and it's based upon their status. And so, for example, for children that were designated as refugees, either before they came or after they arrived, they have a right to be protected based upon their refugee status, and they have the right to be, it's called the non-refoulement rule, which means that basically you cannot send them back to an area where they're likely to be harmed, that we've basically promised to protect them from the country or the circumstances that led to their refugee status in the first place. And then in addition to that, the U.S. is a party to two of my favorite treaties. I actually had a chance to work on the UN Treaty on Child Soldiers, and that treaty includes a number of protections for children who have been forced to be child soldiers in any country. And we have a number of those countries, or a number of those kids here in the United States. And they have what's most relevant to our population on the call today is that they have a right to physical and psychological recovery from that trauma. And so our hospital might be called to provide that care for this population. And then a population that I know that we see quite a lot, and this is another area of focus in my work, is with regard to child prostitution, child pornography, and the sale of children. That's the terminology in the treaty. I'm not being dated. I'm just referring to it using the legal terms. But basically children who have been trafficked and, or otherwise exploited for commercial reasons, that these children also have a right to full physical and psychological recovery. And some of our clinicians here do treat these children. We see these kids pretty regularly in our practices, some of the practices, and we also do provide some follow-on treatment to them and try and refer them to care, which is something that they have a right to under these international treaties. In addition to these broad rights and these very specific rights for certain populations of immigrant children in the United States, all immigrant children have certain healthcare rights that are especially relevant given the work that we do. They have the right to emergency care. You must provide that care first. You can't make it dependent on their status. Regardless of status, they all enjoy the right to free vaccines. They have the same privacy rights as all of our other patients do. Emergency Medicaid is available to them, WIC is available to them, and they have rights to language access that it's important for us to recognize and uphold. And then they have, in addition to these healthcare and general rights, there are certain rights that are tied to their status. So, for example, when a child has a certain status, like a T visa, U visa, DACA, etc., they have the right not to be deported, that you have to follow the process that's set up under their status and in accordance with all other applicable U.S. laws. So there is also certain rights that apply to unaccompanied children, and that's one of the populations that I've worked with most. And in the class action suit Flores, which basically involved a teenage girl who was being housed in the 1980s with unrelated adult males, even in the same room. She was being strip searched. Another girl who was in similar custody down in Texas, the first one, Jenny Flores, she was in California. The other one in Texas was not just being strip searched, she was actually being vaginally searched. And one of my mentors brought a class action suit that ended up being referred to as Flores versus Reno, but it changes with each new attorney general. So now everyone just refers to it as Flores. And this class action suit is still in power today. It's still being enforced by the federal government, although the current administration is trying to terminate Flores oversight of this population of children. But the children who arrive in the United States unaccompanied and are in government custody, they have very basic rights to safe and sanitary conditions. And frankly, a lot of our litigation has been about what does that mean? The government lawyers have said, well, safe and sanitary conditions doesn't mean that they need, for example, toothbrushes or that they need soap, et cetera, and so on. And they've actually said this in the Ninth Circuit. And so we're constantly trying to make sure that children who are in government custody are provided these safe and sanitary conditions, that the Border Patrol facilities can't be too cold. Sometimes when we go in there, they'd be in the high 50s, low 60s. The children wouldn't have blankets. And other times the children hadn't taken showers in weeks. And sometimes they often didn't have access to hot water. There was often significant overcrowding. And so Border Patrol stations are really not, and Border Patrol facilities are really not made for children. We have tried, and we partnered with Paul Weiss of Stanford, who received one of our awards here recently, the Berger Award. But I'm sorry, that might be wrong. I apologize. I won't say the award. But in any event, he's been working for several years to try and improve the conditions and make them more child-friendly in some of the Border Patrol facilities. But unfortunately, many of them are still highly lacking. And so there is a law that requires children to be transferred from the border facilities into the Office of Refugee Resettlement that has more age-appropriate facilities for them. And then the Office of Refugee Resettlement is obligated to place those children with family or a sponsor here in the United States promptly, which is usually interpreted to be several weeks. But I've interviewed children who have been, who have been held in detention in these facilities, sometimes for 9 months or longer, including in like tents in the desert and overcrowded cells and all sorts of horrible conditions. But in any event, they have the right not to be subjected to those things. And so attorneys are constantly trying to support the children in enforcing their rights. So some of the challenges that kids are facing right now in the United States, I've mentioned that there are a number of challenges to establish rights that we have recognized for decades, sometimes over half a century or longer. And then we also have the without even a legal challenge or legal permission to do that, that some of these children's rights are just being violated, that parents are being removed from their children without due process, which both the parents and the children have a right to. And so this is creating a lot of fear with children and families of family separation, that they not only are facing the threat of deportation, but they're also finding that it's harder and harder to unify within the United States. And so a lot of families are going underground, that they're not showing up for court appearances, that if there are acts of violence that, by a stranger or someone they know, they're not going to law enforcement, that, children are not going to school, and people are not seeking services such as healthcare services because they're afraid the more they interact with the system, the more likely they are to be targeted and for their family to be separated. There also is a lot of discrimination. One of the most fascinating pieces of research that I've seen in recent years looks at a profile of children when they first arrive in the United States. And what it finds is that children who have arrived in the United States, particularly those who are unaccompanied, that they have especially high levels of resilience, intelligence, ambition, and they really are the creme de la creme. But after 2 years in the United States, due to discrimination and marginalization and everything, the advantages that they had upon arrival had been lost. And so there is this discrimination that they encounter that is really taking its toll on their health and their well-being. In addition to that, because of language, because of discrimination, because of culture, they experience high levels of isolation, and this isolation is right now increasing because of the targeting of immigrant families. And then they also are looking at a high level of economic insecurity. So 42% of these families that are within 200% of federal poverty levels, they are working really hard. But when you look at the percentage of children, immigrant children who are in intensive work families, where the adults in the household are spending a lot of work hours trying to provide for these kids, that they actually are not able to have a significant impact in the families being categorized as within 200% of federal poverty levels. And they have a much higher level than native-born children of living in crowded housing. So, it's 2.5 times what we see in the mainstream in the US-born, native-born families. And then there also is a real lack of access to resources. So there's a much lower level of enrollment in SNAP. 51% of eligible immigrant-led families enroll versus 62% of all in the United States. But it's not all bad news. We are making progress, and Colorado has, in particular, made an effort to recognize that a significant number of immigrant children are part of our community here in Colorado. And so, effective January 1st of this year, we expanded healthcare coverage in Colorado so that anyone can enroll regardless of their immigration status as long as they're income eligible. And that was a wonderful development. So what can we do about all of these challenges that immigrant children face in the United States? So one thing is that a lot of these children have very traumatic life experiences. I have been taken aback by the personal stories that children and parents have shared with me about what brought them to the United States. That it's been everything from having a teenage daughter literally had all of her limbs cut off because she refused to be a sex slave to a gang leader, and family members, they delivered the body to the family, and the family immediately left for the United States. For the girls who are making their way from the Northern Triangle to the southern border, US and Mexico border, approximately 62% are sexually assaulted on the way here. And so you have this trauma that can happen in the home country. You have a significant amount of trauma that can happen along the way. For those who are not sexually assaulted, we see a large number that are being extorted along the way, a number that are being kidnapped, held for ransom. They find out, they hold you, they say, where's your family? Then they'll call the family and say, send us $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, or we are going to kill your daughter, your mother, your sister, whatever the relationship is. And so there is all of this trauma, and that's on top of leaving your home, leaving your community, maybe losing a parent or a family member before you left. And so it's so critically important that as we're caring for the children in our community, that we make sure that the care that we're providing is trauma informed, and that we leave a curiosity and openness to what we might consider to be abnormal behavior, because it is normal. Their behavior might be normal when rooted in the trauma that they've experienced. Um, Also, trying to recognize that language and communication is a huge barrier for this population, that it can make them feel inadequate, it can make them feel unwelcome. And so we need to recognize that given the large number of languages that are spoken in our community, that we need to be using qualified medical interpreters 24/7. Of course, we have a legal obligation to do this because we do receive federal funds. But independent of that legal obligation, just to provide quality care to this population, it's very important that we have interpreters on site, on call, on hand, and that all the documents that we provide to our patients, that they're translated into a language that they understand, including a level of education that they understand by not overusing medicalese. We want to make sure that we also don't assume literacy because a lot of families, the parents or the grandparents might not be literate. Even the children, of course, might not be literate. And so we need to find ways to communicate with them effectively. In addition to this, it's so important that we show cultural humility and that we're curious as to their beliefs and their values, their traditions. We're seeing this even in the mainstream United States today, of course, where people are suspect of very basic, scientifically supported interventions and supports for health and well-being. And so it's important for us to build relationships of trust with our patients and their families so that we don't demonize people who are resistant to follow our recommendations, but instead try and understand where those reservations are coming from, where those fears are coming from, and to try and build bridges with them that can help us to grow in our understanding of our communities and our patients and their families, as well as to help them to grow so that they can have full access to all of the treatments that are available to them. I mentioned earlier that 90% of immigrant children come from families that have substantial work hour commitments. And I know that many of us, we work during normal working hours, and oftentimes parents aren't there or families aren't there, or sometimes patients don't show up for follow-on appointments. And it's really important for us to understand what the reasons might be and to reach out to them and to create points of access, both spatially and temporally, where they can come and get the follow-up care that they need, or even the initial care that they need. And this might mean that we are more accessible after hours, that it's not been unusual for me when I'm working with these populations to have to meet with them at 8 o'clock at night, because that's the earliest that they could come to meet with me, or sometimes I even have to go to them. And so we have to figure out how we can meet the needs of a population that has very, very heavy work obligations without substantial economic benefit, as I pointed out earlier. And that requires us to be, more flexible and, more flexible and accessible with the services that we provide. And then it's really important for us to recognize that a lot of these families and children, they are living in a culture of fear and isolation. And so we need to figure out how to build a relationship with our community so that they understand that we are a safe place for them, that we are a healing space for them. We can, that if they come here, they will not be deported, that, we have obligations, legal obligations under HIPAA that require us to maintain their privacy rights, and to make sure that they understand that regardless of their status, that, we are a place where, they should come and seek health and wellness and healing from our professionals. And then, I wanted to take a moment and just talk about their lack of access. And we see significantly higher rates of uninsured children with uninsured children among foreign-born children than at in the US more generally. I shared with you the fact that we have this new law that started on January 1st that allows all Coloradans, regardless of status, to be eligible for public insurance here. But as we all have been reading in the newspapers, that the federal support for Medicaid is right now set to be cut significantly. And so it's really important to recognize our patients who are most likely to be affected by this. And of course, this affects, all impoverished children, but especially, children who are foreign born. And many states do not have the inclusive standards that we now have for public insurance in Colorado. And there might be pressure to try and reduce this coverage in Colorado because of the anti-immigrant sentiment that is taking hold in our culture. And so it's really important for us to be fervent and firm in our advocacy for equitable and inclusive payment structures, because if kids can't, if their parents can't pay, if families can't pay, we do know that they are much less likely to seek care, and this can negatively impact their health and well-being. And so it's important for us to be strong and effective advocates for our patients. And with that, I'd like to open it up to questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Binford. What a depressing, but also fascinating, and I think ultimately actionable talk. We really appreciate your being here. I'm going to start off with a question from the audience before I get to mine, because I have several. And for folks who are listening, if you do have questions, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you are welcome to put questions in there. We'll get to as many as we have time for. But our first question is for folks who are being threatened with deportation to countries with which they have no affiliation. Do we have any idea of what they're likely to be subjected to there? Imprisonment, torture, slavery, trafficking, other things? What's the experience like for those people?
Yeah, so I appreciate you bringing up this question because it is such a horrendous and inhumane practice. And it's not something that the United States in modern times has engaged in. And it really shows a level of depravity that the countries that have been chosen to date are especially troublesome. It's not just that the person has no relationship to this country, it's that the conditions of detention in this country are so brutal that the administration's stated purpose in engaging in some inhumane practices targeting our immigrant neighbors and community members is that they want to scare people from coming and they want to scare people into deportation. And so the countries that they've chosen to date are especially brutal, especially inhumane, are not well-known human rights compliant countries. And that's in fact why they are being sent there. And so it is a scare tactic. And unfortunately, what we're hearing from the immigrant community is that it is working and that we have a number of law-abiding and hardworking immigrant community members who are self-deporting because they don't want to risk being sent to one of these countries. And so that's a very good question, but they are actually being sent there as a warning to other people.
Thank you. Another question, along with the trauma-informed medical care we provide, what can we do as individuals or joining groups to support and protect refugee children? Do you recommend any specific advocacy groups or volunteer opportunities? And I would just tack on to that question as well, if you might want to talk a little bit about your experience with healthcare providers and attorneys or legal experts working together, and what that experience has been like.
Yeah, so one of the groups that I am most supportive of is called Kids in Need of Defense. So Kids in Need of Defense has been doing really wonderful work on behalf of children arriving to the United States for decades. And I think that you should look very seriously at getting involved with that group if you'd like to support this population. In particular, the immigrant children in the United States have a right to counsel, just like we all do in proceedings that affect our rights. And but that right to counsel in immigration cases is not allowed to be paid for by the government. We have a federal law that says, yes, of course, kids have a right to counsel, but in immigration proceedings, it can never be paid for with taxpayer funding. And so what happened was the Kids in Need of Defense provided training for attorneys and provided training for children and youth to educate them about their rights, and would try and match up pro bono attorneys with kids in immigration proceedings. And this is especially important because we literally have infants in immigration proceedings with no attorney. We have toddlers with no attorney. We have literally 3-year-olds being placed on the table with no attorney. Of course, teenagers, even though they're older, the immigration process is so complex. It really is a Byzantine process. And it is hard enough for attorneys to understand this process. It's more complex than tax law. And you have so many different rulings coming in from so many different legal authorities that it's almost impossible to know what the law is in many of the situations that these kids face. And so having a dedicated group like Kids in Need of Defense that is both providing legal training to these children as well as providing matching service for pro bono attorneys is really critically important. So I'm a big fan of theirs. Kids in Need of Defense, because they weren't actually providing legal services for children. They were being given government grants to provide the training, but then the current administration has cut off all funding for Kids in Need of Defense. And so now they're especially in need of charitable gifts to continue with that work. And Brian, I feel like I forgot the other question that was embedded in that
Yeah, I
double
was just
question.
asking about your experience with healthcare professionals and attorneys working together to help some of these children.
Okay, so thank you so much for asking that question, because that's why I left a tenured appointment as a law professor and came to a medical school, is because I had such positive experiences working with doctors and psychologists on our multidisciplinary teams when we were going to the facilities. And basically, what happened is that under the Flores agreement, that there was a settlement agreement between the U.S. government and with the children's attorney and children's attorneys. And basically what happened is, as part of that agreement, we were given the right to access our clients at reasonable times, wherever they are, and also to inspect the facilities with multidisciplinary teams that included healthcare providers, both physical, both medical and psychological. And so I started working with medical providers in these facilities, and they added so much to these teams. And what was really transformative for our dynamics with Border Patrol is that whereas we're attorneys and nobody likes us, who doesn't like their doctor? Who doesn't like a nurse? Who doesn't like, a psychologist who's not coming to evaluate them, but somebody else, And they were the behavioral health experts and the medical experts, that they were able to ask questions and evaluate what these kids needed in a much more robust way than we could. And they also came in and they said, oh my gosh, you attorneys, do you guys take any training in conducting trauma-informed interviews of children? We're like, we don't do any training in interviewing children, period, let alone trauma-informed training. And so I've been able to partner with doctors from Stanford to develop trauma-informed training for attorneys who are interviewing children. And that training is also good for other professionals. We also, as I mentioned, we're able to ask the court to appoint Paul Wise from Stanford as a medical expert, and to go down to a number of Border Patrol facilities in Texas and to evaluate them and to make recommendations to make it a more child-friendly space, and to do medical evaluations when they first arrive, and to do those evaluations in a way that were age appropriate given the number of children who have been arriving physically to our borders over the last 10, 15 years. And so our experiences with the medical community has just been outstanding. And since coming to the University of Colorado, I've been so impressed by the number of people who have reached out and said, hey, what can we do to support this population? And when I talk to people about what they've done in their programs at Children's and elsewhere, how they've translated the documents, how they've come in after hours, like, I got those ideas from you all because you're seeing who your patients are and you're saying, what can we do to better meet the needs of our patients? When one of you picks up that the grandma of an immigrant patient isn't literate, that you set the documents aside, and without humiliating her, you in a very respectful way try and answer her questions and give her the most relevant information so that she can properly care for the child patient. And so I've just had a wonderfully positive experience working with all of you, not just at CU and Children's, not just at the university and Children's, but also at Denver Health and at Rady's Hospital. It just has been in Stanford. I mean, it's just been amazing to work with the medical community and see how much you all care for these kids.
Thank you. This is maybe a little bit more straightforward logistical type question, but is it appropriate for me to ask families where they're from, or does that put them in an awkward position and make them feel like they're unsafe?
I think I think it depends on how it's done and on your relationship. And so a lot of families, and especially in the current culture and environment, political environment, they might not feel safe telling you that unless you have an established relationship with them. But I think that what you can safely do is be curious about them in a way that you see them. And this is something that was it's part of the healing process for all of us. There's a lot of research that's being done on trauma and healing from trauma, and being seen by others, being honored by others, being heard, other people showing an interest in you can help you to heal, can help you to recover. And it also, even if you haven't had a significant trauma, it can build your resilience so that you're better able to navigate trauma when you encounter it, which all of us will eventually. And so I think that if you are showing a curiosity and a respect and an interest in them, that's the right approach. And whether that curiosity is, where were you born? Where did you come from? Because that can be othering to assume that because of their presentation that they came from another country. And so it might take time for you to discover where they're from, but it's something that's a natural curiosity, but it might not be the first question you ask in this political environment. But you absolutely should show an interest and curiosity in them, and I'm so glad that you do.
Another question that I don't think you'll be able to answer exactly this question, but I'm going to take it a little bit different direction. The question is, what is children's position if ICE decides to come into the hospital to detain a family member or patient themselves? Is training being planned? But I might take that a little bit more broadly, since I don't think you can speak about children specific. But how are hospitals in general responding to the threat of ICE coming into their facilities? Are there things that hospitals across the country are doing to prepare to respond to those situations?
Yeah, I think that that's a great question for folks to ask, the leadership at Children's. I don't know what they're doing. What I can tell you is that I have worked with children and families who had children who were sick that were in children's hospitals, and I have been inspired by how hard the staff and the leadership in those hospitals have tried to do everything that they can to protect the children's health and well-being and to prepare the necessary documentation for us to go to Border Patrol or to go to the courts and seek protections for the kids and to allow parents to stay in the hospital with them. And that in the cases that I've been involved in, at least for the duration that I was involved in, it was thanks to the hospital staff and leadership that the kids were able to stay in the hospital and get the care that they need. And we were also able to prevent, in one case, a father from being wrongfully deported while his children were in the hospital, thanks to the documentation of the leadership and what the clinical team recommended for the children's care. And so I do know that there is a significant role for you in these types of cases, but for ICE in particular showing up and what the hospital's policies are, that's not something I can speak to, but I think it is something that probably leadership has already thought through, and they probably already have a plan given how prevalent some of these efforts have been.
Thank you. Is there a contingency plan if the federal government approves budget cuts for health insurance programs? How would we continue to provide health care to immigrant children if that happened?
Well, you guys are asking, I feel right now like I am, so not helpful. But the fact is that again, this is something that is way above my pay grade. I know that, Brett Rudy on the university side is working furiously with university leadership to try and pass new legislation that would reestablish funding for some, in some of the Medicaid and other healthcare cuts that have been made. And that there is, I'm being told the same thing you all are, which is that there are a number of people who voted in favor of the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, the HB1, that supported that bill with the understanding that they'd be able to go back in and replace some of the funding that was pulled under that bill. And so I know that there is a concentrated effort that the university is involved in. I suspect that that children's advocates, legislative advocates, are also involved in that effort, and I know that the AAP is as well. And so I think that many of us are hopeful that based upon the commitment that congressional members have made to replacing that funding, that we'll be able to follow through and get that funding replaced. But if it's not replaced, then, people way more powerful than I will have to tell you how it's going to be prioritized. But that is part of the fear that I shared about we just have this new universal coverage regardless of status in Colorado, but will that change in light of the state budget challenges that are being projected for the coming years? I mean, that is part of what scares me, is that sometimes the people who need it most are going to lose it.
I'm going to try and squeeze in two last questions. The first is, how do parents who are here illegally or undocumented get a visa for their children that were born here, or actually go about getting their Social Security card for their children?
Well, so for any child that's born in the United States, they are entitled to apply for a Social Security number, and they should apply for a Social Security number because it's hard to navigate, the modern system without a Social Security number. And so as long as they were born in the US, they should have no problem. One of the things, of course, that's required for that is a birth certificate. And I know that there is a movement right now to have more and more out of hospital births. And one of the challenges with that is that it might limit the witnesses. And this is something that's come up with some of the kids in the families that I've worked with, is that if there was no one who witnessed the child being born in the United States, that in a really harsh environment like we're navigating right now, the child's birthright citizenship could be denied. And so I think one of the priorities at Children's Hospital right now is to really encourage people to have hospital births and to make sure that they understand that that could compromise their ability to identify a witness to the birth and to make it easier for the child to apply for a Social Security card, to get a passport. I know a number of people who are naturalized citizens who walk around with their passports in their back pocket, or walk around with their Social Security card or birth certificate, et cetera. So it is critically important to get all your documentation in place for your children, even if you are not documented yourself.
Thank you. Our last question, hopefully to end on a little bit more of a positive note. The work you're doing is incredibly amazing. How do you stay motivated in a time like this where it seems like things are only going to continue to get worse with this administration?
Okay, so I think about this all the time, okay? And here's what motivates me is all the goodness in the world. And I am always looking for where is the goodness, where is the light, where, what can keep me going. And in almost every child that I interact with, I see goodness in many, 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 the majority of people in serving professions. I see goodness, the acts that you do, your connection with the children, your service to children, financial sacrifices to be in pediatrics versus, a more lucrative line of practice, et cetera. Even in the Border Patrol stations, I am pulled aside at virtually every single facility I go to, and somebody pulls me aside who works there, and sometimes it is the head of the Border Patrol station and says, I need you to be successful. I need you to get this kid out. I need you to get these kids out. Like they don't belong here. We don't have the right facilities for them. The administration is refusing to send buses to come get them or arrange for their transfer, et cetera, and so on. And it's like people that we sometimes demonize as being the bad people or on the bad side, they too will reach out to me and say, what can I do to support you in helping these kids? Because I'm a mom, I'm a dad, and it's like what's happening here is not right. And so I really try and focus on not the bad stuff. I try and use the bad stuff to keep me working, but I keep the goodness that's all around me to keep me hopeful. And, you need both the motivation, you need to have purpose in life, but you also need to have hope. And so it's all of you that provide me with that hope. So thank you so much for all that you do on the front lines so that I can be hopeful in the work that I do.
Professor Binford, thank you. This has been absolutely enlightening. It's been, I think, even hope-inducing, despite the times that we're living through, giving us actionable things that we all can do. I'm sorry for folks who asked questions that we didn't get a chance to get to every question in the list. There were so many good questions, so thank you for submitting those. And I'd also like to remind folks that our next Pediatric Ethics Grand Rounds will be also at an unusual time. It'll be October 28th at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. And the reason for that is that our speaker for that round will be speaking to us from Australia. And rather than have her speak at 3 in the morning, we decided to do it in the afternoon, our time. So 4 p.m. on Tuesday, October 28th. We hope to see you then. Again, thank you, Professor Binford, and I hope everybody has a great rest of your afternoon.
And Brian, I just want to say the people who have questions that they couldn't ask them, reach out. Like I'm here. I'm one of you. I'm your colleague. And so if you want to talk about these issues, I'm more than happy to take any of those questions privately. So just reach out to me, okay?
Thank you. We really appreciate that.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Thanks, everyone.